Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us during this lunch hour for this important and exciting panel that we're going to have today. My name is Hillary Brill, and I am the interim executive director of Georgetown's Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy, where we work on issues at the intersection of technology, law, and policy. You are here for the panel with our esteemed panelists on the epidemic of online information, an analysis of gaps in research, and an exploration of next steps. And I've been looking forward to hearing what our panelists have to say. The issues on content moderation and how to best regulate disinformation online, especially when it exploits racial and gender divisions and can undermine democracy, are at the core of the work that the co-host at the Center for Democracy and Technology of this panel has been working on. And there's a report specifically on this that will be at the heart of the discussion that we're going to be hearing about today. So thank you to the co-host, Center for Democracy and Technology. The Institute and the Center have had a long working relationship together, and we have had several fellows at the Institute work with us, and we are pleased that one of the authors of this actual report is a former Institute alum. So we definitely feel connected both in product and heart and minds on the issues that are central to that report. And we not only want to thank them, but we want to move forward and talk about the fact that online information, disinformation, the effects of its the effects and concerns and the consequences of these issues are affecting each and every one of us during the pandemic. Before the pandemic, they were concerned, and they're going to be a concern after. And what is specifically essential and exciting about this panel is that there's a bit more of how-to. It's not just a discussion of hot topics and events and what happened and what is our quick take, which we have great events that we've done on that before if you want to go look at them at both CDT and Georgetown. But it's also, where do we go from here? What are the gaps? What do we know? What do we not know? And how do we take that and do something that has social impact? And we are going to be hearing about that today. So welcome, panelists. Welcome, thought leaders and experts on content moderation, journalism, technology, and more. And that is technology. Apologies to whoever did that, and we heard that. Our moderator of today's panel is Professor Anupam Chander from Georgetown, who is a CDT fellow. And he specializes in scholarship related to technology and policy issues, including online information, but also global tech issues. And he is also the leader of Georgetown's Global TechNet Working Group that works on these issues and others as well. And he's going to be leading the conversation with Nora Benavides. Nora, who is guiding PEN America's national advocacy agenda on First Amendment and free expression issues. We also have Erin Carroll, professor at Georgetown Law Center, who teaches her course on legal analysis and communication, as well as technology and the press. And she focuses on the dramatic changes in the press and information issues related to it. And we are happy to have Saif Savage from West Virginia University and a CDT fellow who directs the Human Computer Interaction Institute and co-directs the UNAM Civic Tech Lab, where she's designing intelligent platforms that help citizens to produce collective action to fight disinformation. And a very special welcome to our Tech Institute alum and one of the authors of the report, our former Tech fellow, Devin Hankerson-Madrigals, who is now currently at Center for Democracy and Technology. She is CDT's research manager and, among many other things, an advocate for improving technology access to expand individual rights and ensuring that more people share in the benefits of technological progress. I want to note that there is a question and answer section. I hope that those of you in the audience are going to be engaged and ask lots of questions. I have a feeling you will. Feel free, it's an interactive panel and it's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And with that, I would like to turn this over to Professor Anupam Chander.
Thank you very much, Professor Brill. It's an honor to host this conversation and to see this collaboration between the CDT and Georgetown Tech Institute. So we have a lot of great panelists with a lot of important insights, and so let's get right into it. So I want to turn the First question to Professor Savage. How do disinformation or misinformation operations exploit often racial and gender divisions to undermine democracy and further marginalize particular communities?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you also for the question. It's an honor to be here. So my research has been looking specifically at how the Latinx community is targeted within the US. Some of the things that we are finding is, on one hand, it has become problematic that a number of news sources in the US that are talking to the Latinx community are not talking to them about political issues. And so there are certain knowledge gaps that exist around the information that is shared with the Latinx community. And what we are finding is that political trolls are then coming and covering those knowledge gaps. What are they doing? They are the ones that are addressing the Latinx community and are sharing, for instance, news reports and information about what allegedly certain events mean to the Latinx community. And that becomes problematic because given that there is little information for the Latinx community about what is going on politically, the political trolls can then cover up the information with what they want, with the agendas that they want, and it becomes very hard to verify whether or not that information is accurate. And we are also seeing that these political trolls have become actually pretty good at targeting the different issues that different Latinx community has. So, for instance, they're creating content that is specific for the Mexican American, also content that is specific for the Venezuelan American or Cuban American. To them, for instance, they're creating content around how, for instance, Biden was allegedly a socialist. To the Mexican American, they were creating content around how Biden had collaborated with a former Mexican ex-president who was very corrupt. And so it's very hard for the Latinx community to verify whether or not that information is valid because the other news sources are not discussing those political topics. And so that's a little way in which political disinformation is targeting the Latinx community and how they're weaponizing these data voids. Thank you.
Thank you. That's incredibly insightful. And Nora Benavides, what is your experience with this at Penn America?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm seeing this panel and it's just, it's an amazing set of experts. And, I think from the outset, it's so good to acknowledge how necessary research is and documenting what we're seeing. Because a lot of what I see is incredibly siloed communities online. Part of our work at Penn America has been to look at how disinformation divides us, how would-be allies, colleagues, friends, often really are torn on wedge issues and are torn because the narratives we see online prey on our own vulnerabilities. So I'm Latina. I love hearing Safe's characterizing the way the Latino community is targeted. We know that, for example, Spanish-speaking immigrants are really given different content than born in the US Latinos. The Hispanic, the Mexican American, the Noras are given different content than people who arrived here and really are more of the diaspora in a range of areas. Brookings Institution just did a really great study on how similar diasporic communities are in the ways that they're given content and misleading content. But part of what we're seeing, I think, is just the level of chaos online that leads the communities we work with in our misinformation and our media literacy trainings to not know where to turn. They will hear a kernel of a rumor, and this is a range of groups: veterans, Black and brown voters, a really pretty wide swath of groups that will hear one thing and lead them to a set of attitudes and values. And I think it's important that, when we kind of step back in that question, we acknowledge this moment of just incredible division, which is something all of us on the panel know. And I think a lot of people attending are intuitively aware of. But the silos we exist in amplify that division. Groups like The Markup have done amazing work recently in examining who gets credible information right now about COVID. And part of what we're finding is that Native American, Middle Eastern, Black users on Facebook are given the least access to the most credible information. So that means that disenfranchisement is, I think, one of the primary goals of disinformation. Whether it's foreign or domestic interference, we're seeing groups similar to how Black voters were targeted in 2016, Latino voters have been targeted in the 2020 election, and it's really all to prey on groups that would otherwise not quite have a way of accessing and making sense of credible information. So the goal of these types of campaigns is to create chaos, the confusion, and the division that leads to breakdowns in discourse.
Well, this is incredibly concerning, and I can, attest that in my own South Asian community, WhatsApp groups are often a platform for sharing disinformation, and it's, as you pointed out, exactly hyper targeted to within that particular group, and I think it is part of the information silos that individuals often exist in. Professor Carroll, I'd love to have your thoughts on this question as well.
Yes, first, I just want to say thank you to CDT, to Devin, to Hillary, to you for inviting me to be part of this illustrious group. I know CDT has already done some wonderful research in thinking about what questions are out there. PEN America is doing that too. This is obviously a really many-tentacled problem. And I want to kind of focus on one tentacle, knowing that it's just one tentacle of the problem. Something that I've been thinking about is the absolute explosion in the number of attacks that we are seeing online against women journalists, and especially women journalists of color. A UNESCO study, a recent one, just in 2020, found that 41% of women journalists online said that they had been subjected to online violence that was perceived to be part of an orchestrated disinformation campaign. So violence can also include doxing, it can include death threats, that it can include rape threats. We know this is a global phenomenon. Most publicized examples are, for example, Maria Ressa in the Philippines and her publication, The Rappler, which is doing accountability work in the Philippines, and she's been the target of brutal online disinformation campaigns run by supporters of the authoritarian government there, and is now facing trumped up political charges in the wake of that. I was listening actually to a report, to a webcast this morning of people talking about this exact problem, and they quoted Ms. Ressa saying something that I thought was powerful, which is, the easiest part is dealing with the impact of online violence and disinformation on me. I just see the impact on the world, and I don't know why we're not panicking. We see the same thing with Rana Ayub, an Indian journalist who's been the subject of death and rape threats and disinformation campaigns for work that she's done in India. And this online disinformation is growing at an absolutely eye-popping rate. In a study of journalists just this fall done in coordination with the UN, 73% of women journalists said they had experienced online abuse, harassment, threats, and attacks. And the Council of Europe is now saying that being a journalist is one of the most dangerous professions out there. And so while the studies I've just talked about focus on women in different countries, this is certainly happening in the United States as well. Plus, these studies have emphasized that the line between offline and online violence is very, very thin. So the US Press Freedom Tracker follows and tries to document evidence of offline violence against journalists. Literally last year, they could not keep up with the number of reports they got. The violence had exploded by somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000% from the year before. So to make this tie back to disinformation explicit, this abuse, in the form of disinformation campaigns, the ultimate intent of this is to silence women and to silence women of color. And so we lose their stories, we lose their narratives, we lose their journalism, we lose voices that are challenging hierarchy. And we stay closer to a white male baseline of information and the status quo. There's some preliminary signs that this, and scary signs that this is working. Some of the studies are showing that women are thinking about leaving journalism, are leaving journalism, and are thinking harder about entering journalism to begin with. And then that becomes a vicious cycle, right? Because then when we have this vacuum, we know that disinformation then fills those vacuums.
So, Devin, you have been working very hard on these issues and chronicling them. So can you tell us a little bit about your study?
Sure. I think, what everyone has said so far really kind of ties into what our report sort of really focused on when it comes to the lack of empirical research that sort of gets at some of these questions. And I think that, just like Professor Carroll was just saying, there are a lot of really important anecdotes and studies that are starting to show some of the impacts. And just to echo something of what Saif and Nora kind of said earlier about where the research community sits, I think, disinformation campaigns, as we've discussed, sort of exploit these like multiple forms of like simultaneous discrimination. And as we've sort of discussed, they sort of rely on these existing narratives like gender bias, like Professor Carroll was just talking about, or like other narratives that kind of like stem from other forms of historical discrimination to like build credibility for the false information that's being shared. And I think, by not sufficiently examining this particular feature, I think we may be missing the point of disinformation operations entirely. I think the disproportionate targeting of people of color online and women online further undermines this like larger societal goal of inclusive democracy, especially set against this backdrop, which is sort of American history of institutional practices and legislation in the United States that have limited opportunities for democratic participation of women and people of color both today and in the recent past. And I think Professor Carroll was sort of indicating that same effect as it relates to women of color journalists online and sort of forcing them out of the space. It's this sort of like push out of, having your voices heard.
Great. Devin, are you thinking of any particular examples? Do you have, examples in mind of this kind of targeting and this kind of silencing, as Professor Carroll spoke about?
Well, we know that like there have been a couple of studies that we sort of point to in our report that focus on the way that trolls and disinformation operatives sort of use, and we haven't talked about it yet here, but pose as being part of other communities to spread disinformation and to bully people off of whatever platform they're using to voice their opinion. And we know that civil society organizations and activists have been working, sort of chronicling a lot of these anecdotes. But I think that like our report really focuses on the fact that there needs to be more empirical research that really focuses on these types of questions in order to really produce the kind of solutions that will effectively counter disinformation beyond sort of fact checking alone. And I think that's sort of what the thrust of our work is, to really get the research community sort of chronicling these anecdotes so that there can be a more robust conversation around like evidence around impacts, particularly around like election participation and those kinds of questions. So I think that's sort of what the goal of our project is, sort of generally. And if I know that like others probably have other more specific examples, but I think the lack of research is what we really want to call attention to for what it's worth.
Great, and I'm going to come back to you on this lack of research and get you to tell us even more about this, where exactly we need to be spending our time figuring out what's going on. So let me turn to a second question. How can internet platforms and governments try to help rebuild trust in democratic institutions, specifically for communities targeted for disinformation online? So let me begin with Professor Erin Carroll on this question.
All right, so I'd like to kick this off by focusing on one institution in particular that might not be surprising given my answer to the first question, and that's the press. And I think because it's emblematic, perhaps, of the precipitous nature of the drop of trust in American institutions. According to polling by Gallup, and Gallup has probably, I think, been polling since the mid-50s about trust in the American media. And we saw the lowest levels of that trust during the Trump presidency. The press is really also key to the health of our information environment, which is then, of course, key to the health of our democracy. And I think the pandemic has created an opportunity for us to really see the press as a true public good, as an essential service and a place where we can get, in different communities can get information that they need. I was surprised to learn in research over last summer that epidemiologists even rely on local news to try and track the spread of disease. And so the difficulties with local news just evaporating actually have an impact on our public health system even. So we need to understand news as essential for democracy and funding it like it is rather than relying on the market. So we have a very short-term memory in the United States, and that, for so much of the time that the press was building itself in our country, it was heavily subsidized by the government through postal subsidies. And to the extent that the press has worked as a market, that was over a fairly short period of time in the late 20th century. If we want high quality, accurate, contextualized, democracy enhancing information, we need a system to pay for it. And current business models really are not working right now. And I heard Ethan Zuckerman at University of Massachusetts say over a conference this past weekend, the public sphere is too important to leave up to the market. There needs to be some kind of funding to help the press, but there really needs to be more than that. It can't just be that the press exists. It has to be that the press functions in the way that it needs to and is trusted. And it isn't right now. And it isn't, I would say, in part for a very good reason, because our mainstream press has really rarely served marginalized communities well. And in fact, it has often affirmatively really harmed them. The stories the press is telling are often grounded in a white male perspective. So-called objectivity has been through a white male lens. In the past year, we've seen Black reporters told that they can't objectively cover protests, or Asian American reporters told that they can't objectively cover anti-Asian violence. So there needs to be a wholesale rethinking that I think is starting to happen already about just what that means. There's also, I think, as we all know, a chronic and severe lack of diversity in American newsrooms. This is dated back since forever, but there was focus on it, at least in the late 1960s, the 1967 Kerner Commission, which was commissioned by President Johnson in the wake of violence across American cities, trying to figure out the cause of the violence. And one of the interesting kind of conclusions of that commission was too much of the news is seen through a white male lens, and we are not serving marginalized communities in the way that we should. And the press committed to making changes at that time, and those changes really have not been made. Now, to end on a more optimistic note, there are things happening right now. So I'm thinking, for example, of the Los Angeles Times, where, to be totally transparent, my husband happens to be a reporter, but there's been a real racial reckoning there in the last year. It's come out that, things like 13% of their newsroom is Latinx in a city that is 50% Latinx. And the paper has had, editorials and articles trying to reckon with its racist past. And we'll see if that leads to a change in the numbers in the newsroom. Other interesting projects, the Oakland Side, which is a nonprofit newsroom in Oakland led by a woman of color, that really started by going to the community and trying to listen and see what that community needed in terms of information, and is trying to build a newsroom around that. Some of you may have read recently about the Emancipator, which is a new project between the Boston Globe and BU Center for Anti-Racist Research, and it's to create a modern day version of an abolitionist newspaper from the 19th century. And so there are really interesting projects happening. News needs to rethink its priorities and methods and approaches, and platforms and governments can't do that for them. And I don't think we want platforms and governments doing that for them, but government can help to fund newsrooms, and it can provide news. It can help to fund them in a way that funds these communities that need news, these communities that have not been covered in the way that they need to be covered. So those are just some things to think about in terms of building back up institutions and the trust in institutions.
Thank you, Professor Carroll. And I really appreciate both your identification of some of the problems, but also some suggestions of positive approaches that might address those problems. But can I ask Professor Savage to tell us what her suggestions might be for platforms and governments, and maybe, as Professor Carroll has said, the press itself?
Yeah, I think that we need to take especially an intergovernment approach when we're thinking about how to address this problem. I think that also that we need to think about how do we involve different industries as well as providing courses through which we can guide the different industries into ways in which they can address the fact-checking problem, and ways in which they can engage with minority groups, and ways in which they can best help minority groups to navigate the disinformation space. And I think that the best way to start to address this problem is thinking about how can we involve different government agencies who might have, for instance, different hearsay about maybe it's providing skill development. Maybe it's also ways in which we can organize different scientists to start to look at this problem. I'm also thinking that given that disinformation is very much a global problem, for instance, we were seeing that the fact checkers, the Latinx fact checkers, their content was being weaponized by political actors in Mexico, even though they were working just within the US. And so given that we have this, we currently have a problem where different political actors across the globe can jump in. We need to start looking at this from a global perspective. And so I think that we also need to provide incentives so that globally we can work together to address this problem.
Nora Benavides, how would you suggest that governments, platforms, and perhaps the press approach these issues? I really appreciate Professor Savage's pointing out that these are global issues and we need intergovernmental and international solutions as well. So that's an incredibly important point.
Well, I mean, the question is sort of how do we fix all of it? And, I think some of the question, baked into the question is the premise that we would have a goal of healthier functioning democratic institutions, which is not the goal of many officials and leaders. And in fact, part of the work we do at PEN America is in adjacent spaces to the disinformation realm is really examine the anti-democracy movement, both on the policy level and other efforts to roll back rights and free expression. I think disinformation then bleeds into all of that. And I believe that when we talk about solutions, part of it, and I'm not being flippant, we have to talk about how we build political will to value, as Professor Carroll talked about, all of the things that matter, to also then have the research to show, for example, that when we have less local and robust news, there is more government corruption. We know this. When there is less local journalism, people are less likely to vote. When we have rampant disinformation, a whole cascade effect of various things happen. People may be disenfranchised, confused, torn throughout communities, less likely to be able to make sense of and come to conclusions based on facts and science. So when I think about solutions, I think that there's no silver bullet. But I think that the interdisciplinary conversations between governments and platforms are necessary. And some of that includes actually, I think, early promising efforts to embed human rights and civil rights frameworks in our platforms. I have problems in many ways with the self-governance of something like a Facebook oversight board, but I think the notion that steps towards increasing diversity and commitments to human rights are critical. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater in beginning to be more creative. I feel like we're in such early regulatory phases, almost like the early airplane days, not quite knowing how we're going to regulate the online realm here. And yet feeling around for solutions, I just don't think we can only think about government as doing this or platforms as only doing this. We have to really come to the table with an innovative set of solutions and an innovative set of experts. So that's a long way of not giving you any answer in many ways, I'll admit. I think the concrete ideas and some of what we're working on at Penn is one, pushing for public funding of local journalism. And I was so thrilled to hear Professor Carroll talking about this, because this is a big piece of our work, is trying to thread the needle on these issues and show why local journalism is both an antidote to building healthier institutions and to combating disinformation. I also then think we need interventions where the government takes more seriously disinformation throughout agencies, both executive and legislative branches. And one of those ideas that we are pursuing is media literacy education. How media literacy can be one of the inoculation tools to combating the spread of all of these ills. But I do, I won't go on and on, but I just really kind of want to make sure that we're grounded in knowing that the lack of a single solution means each of us, and I'm seeing it's all women, and I'm loving that, that we're all, and the people here today are thinking about solutions that way. If your role is only influencing your community, know that that matters. We don't just need the policy wonks like me.
So those are incredibly helpful comments. And I want to begin by just noting that your observation that the premise that everyone wants to reduce disinformation is clearly wrong, and that there are governments even that are, of course, champions of disinformation. And so this complicates all international solutions dramatically. And I think that's an incredibly important point. So your hesitation to offer an immediate solution to the problem for what governments should do, I think is wise, because governments may well use that to abet further disinformation or control information channels even more deeply. Yeah, Devin.
Go on. I just wanted to add something that we've sort of been thinking about at CDT, obviously in the context of the work that we've done, but I think, researchers can really help us understand more about the impacts and trends of disinformation, but they often lack access to social media services data about disinformation campaigns and their effects. And we think, just to this question that you asked, internet platforms can help aid efforts to combat disinformation by sharing that data with independent scholars and researchers, including data on content account removals. Actually, this is one of the questions that CDT has suggested members of Congress ask tech CEOs at tomorrow's House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee hearings. Do companies share data with independent researchers on disinformation? And if so, how and when? I think one good example I can point to here is the NYU Ad Observer. I think everybody kind of watched that story where they received a highly publicized cease and desist notice from Facebook for a browser extension collecting data for research purposes on who political advertisers targeted on the platform. So I think as Nora was sort of talking about concrete solutions, that's one that I think we can offer that's sort of concrete and sort of is relevant, particularly in the moment.
That is very helpful. So this goes to the third question as well. So it helps the research gaps. There's a lot that we don't know. Where should we be? And I'm going to turn this to you first, Evan. So I'm going to come back to you immediately. What don't we know, and what do we need to try to find out? You've already mentioned, we need greater access to information such as whom political ads are targeted to, which the NYU Ad Observatory is trying to gain in this complicated domain of gathering information that may have some privacy implications and et cetera. So it's a complicated story. And of course, Cambridge Analytica was a story of a researcher who was given access to Facebook, but that wasn't policed, and exploited that information to great ill effect.
Yeah, I think research on these topics, I think since the past couple of years, the past couple of election cycles we've seen has developed really rapidly, but sort of lacks a focus on the impacts on women, people of color, on LGBTQIA+ communities, and other voices that are typically less prominent in mainstream political discourse. I think it misses, one, the strategic use of racist and misogynist narratives as vehicles for false information, and two, racially targeted disinformation aimed at suppressing votes from communities of color and trying to diminish participation by women online or in the political discourse. So there's sort of an intersection there, an important intersection there that I think it's important to point to. So I'll just say before I get into some of the gaps that we've identified in the paper, I think, the reason disinformation spreads, it's because the ground is fertile. In other words, operators are sort of targeting women and communities of color precisely because these communities are marginalized by mainstream American society, and in some cases, obviously, have been domestic targets of voter suppression. But to this question, I think, more work is needed on the definition and measurement of disinformation. A greater focus on race, gender, and intersectionality, I think, can help sort of address this problem of definition by improving how we assess the impact and harm of disinformation. Second, we aren't able to identify the impact of disinformation on electoral outcomes, for example, on political opinions or on trust in political institutions, nor are we really able to provide evidence on impacts in cases where disinformation is about or targets people by race and gender. Other research gaps I'll highlight are measuring coordination and shared views between actors and sort of capturing the fluidity between misinformation and disinformation. I think being able to measure this coordination between actors would really go a long way to helping us discern the precise role of influencers in disinformation campaigns. And in our paper, we actually sort of cover some of the work of researchers, SAFE included, who sort of note the role of influencers in some communities. One of the researchers that we point to is Mutali Nkande, whose work on the #ADOS movement, and also on others who have focused on instances where domestic actors are sort of amplifying online messaging, and they may be sort of unwittingly aiding disinformation operations. So really teasing out some of that fluidity and also coordination. I mean, there are some important questions here I want to make sure to highlight. For example, how is coordination maintained when the coordination is not explicit? To what extent is coordination supported through shared views of either patriarchy or white supremacy? These are some of the questions that we raise in the paper that was sort of discussed earlier, but I won't take up all the time. I'll sort of pass it on to to my fellow colleagues. But before I do want to sort of like highlight the sort of this intersectional lens that we sort of talk about in detail. And the reason I think it's important because there's this approach really would allow researchers to sort of see exactly how this exploitation of existing narratives of discrimination might occur. And then to sort of get back to your question about an example, one that really pops out to me is the birtherism narrative around like then VP candidate Kamala Harris. The reason it takes off is because it has racist undertones. I mean, reporting from the AP sort of highlighted at the time that Harris was subject to 4 times as much mis and disinformation as compared to white men in similar campaigns over the past 4 years. And I think without this sort of comprehensive kind of evidence and an intersectional analysis of disinformation would provide, the policy and legislative solutions we put forward may sort of fall short, in the sense that they'll be sort of ineffective at combating disinformation, which, as we sort of discussed, is sort of aimed to undermine trust in democratic institutions.
Wow, that is it's incredibly important and powerful. So thank you. And I think the intersectional lens, we have transparency reports, but the transparency reports have not been, intersectional. And I think that's a hugely important contribution to our thinking about these things. I'm going to turn, for the interest of time, I'm going to turn to one last speed question for all of you. So this is just a kind of a fun question, so I'm going to get a view from everyone of the panel. So Donald Trump was seen as a major source of disinformation. The Washington Post counts more than 30,000 lies. Should Facebook restore Donald Trump's account by the end of this year? I'm going to begin with Nora Benavides.
You had to begin with me. I couldn't I couldn't wait and see what consensus drew. Just recently it came out that there were a very select few dozen of super spreaders of misinformation on Facebook and Twitter. And I think it's a kind of intuitive conclusion many of us in this space already knew, and then researchers have confirmed over the last several months that and years that there are often a very finite set of accounts that spread the most harmful and misleading content. When Donald Trump was removed from Twitter, Signal Labs found that 73% of misinformation on the platform had been reduced. That also takes into account other super spreader accounts on the platform. I think his account should not be reinstated. I'm happy being on the record. I'm an attorney. I'm always on the record. Anything I say is public for anyone to point back to. For a number of reasons, and I'm curious for everyone else's thoughts, but I think that we are in a moment where the platforms have to begin developing some typology around what the harms and likelihood of virality look like around different accounts. And when those accounts spread X percentage with a very wide audience reach, they account for some of the most egregious and viral content. And so I think, from my legal perspective, I'm often cautious, certainly from my free expression perspective. I am cautious about what happens when we remove a potential leader. I think that in the lead up to the election, it was actually incredibly incumbent on the platforms to maintain the account for the public to see an unvarnished view of then President Trump. But the free expression tensions with the larger societal and democratic harms are ones that, in balance, I think tilt towards his needing to remain offline. And those are incredibly difficult conclusions to come to. So when I say I think he shouldn't, that is really in the interest of time for our panel. And also, why not be a provocateur? I mean, I think for the sake of the argument, it's fun. And I think that it's grounded, frankly, in how we imagine and build towards a healthier internet for more people. When we know that some of the worst content is proliferated by and given oxygen by that individual.
Great, thank you. Thank you for going on record with, and I apologize for not giving you enough space to.
Don't worry, I'm always on the record.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn to Professor Carroll.
So I really appreciate Nora's response, and I tend to agree with her. I was also going to invoke the same report that she mentioned that came out recently by the Election Integrity Partnership, talking about how there were a very limited number of super spreaders that were responsible for a huge amount of the disinformation around the 2020 campaign and leading up to January 6th. I do wonder if that cuts both ways. I mean, we could say, okay, so then there's a limited number of people we could deplatform and perhaps cut off at the knees a lot of disinformation. I also wonder if there aren't more engineering or other tactics or other levers we could use to create more friction around those accounts, whether it would be to cut off liking, to cut off sharing, to create delays, to do other things on select accounts that have been identified as being these kinds of sources. And frankly, it goes back to all of Devin's points about how we just don't have enough information to know how well that works. And so it's really hard to make those calls.
Professor Savage.
Sorry. So I've done a lot of interviews actually with pro-Trump supporters because I've been studying in detail how they have been organizing. So based on my research, I actually believe that he should be able to return to social media because you have over 70 million people who supported him, who voted for him. You're removing an actor who you're removing a leader who these individuals are looking up to and who they actually they do believe. I think this should be the decision about whether or not he should be removed should not be a decision that a private company such as Facebook or Twitter makes, but rather it should be a decision that is made by different government agencies, by different industries. We should have a public conversation around whether or not he should be able to return. What worries me about him being removed from, for instance, from Facebook or Twitter is precisely that what happened is that now you have alt tech platforms that emerged. So these are other platforms where his supporters are gathering onto, and now they're having echo chambers where it becomes even more problematic because within these echo chambers, now they're spreading together much more disinformation. You can think about how they might be even more radicalized. And so I think it's better to have them together within, for instance, a space where we can have conversations all together, and it's easier to avoid radicalization of these echo chambers. And so I'm worried about the creation of alt tech platforms, other platforms where now their supporters are, and the people that maybe are believing him are going off to, and now we're not able to reach them, and they might become even more radicalized. And so that's why I believe that he should be able to return. And it can be better to instead have conversations with his supporters about, hey, you know what, for instance, maybe he's promoting election fraud. You know what, here's some evidence about why there wasn't election fraud. And so I think that it's better to have those conversations instead of saying like, no, you know what, we're going to shut you down, because that also helps to promote even more conspiracy theories. Because now, for instance, our supporters are now saying like, no, look, they're shutting us down. We can't even have conversations around this. And so I think it's better to have it all up in the open and show evidence so that we can engage with them and we can avoid the radicalization.
Devin.
Sure. So I'll say to kind of have a little bit of distance from this question, but that there is a broad need for improving processes. CDT submitted comments to help the Facebook Oversight Board consider its overall approach on these types of questions back in February, actually. And in light of those comments, I will add that Facebook should take real world context into account and a speaker's prominence in society when weighing appropriate responses. One idea I'll share put forward by CDT's free expression team is that Facebook should improve its internal escalation process for moderating decisions about political leaders. This process could include providing clear training and guidance for moderators on when to escalate reviews of their content, and creating a specialized team under the umbrella of trust and safety to assess whether statements by political leaders will incite violence. And I'll leave it there.
Great. Devin, you've done an incredible job of capturing CDT and channeling all the research that the CDT has done. So thank you. I'm going to ask 3 questions from the audience, and there are a lot of great questions. These I can just ask in a short way. I'm going to put them on the table and then just go around the room, and you can choose whichever question you want to answer. And it is going to have to be a lightning round again because we only have 8 minutes left. So let me just ask the questions very quickly. So the first question is the FCC's fairness doctrine. Should that be reinstated now for social media? This is a question put by Sohaig Marianne Hakimi. A second question. So the first question is fairness doctrine. Second question, would a trust busting approach help reduce disinformation? So this is a question put by Sam Wollenberg. Trust busting to respond to misinformation. A third question put by Carl Edward Landwehr. Government financing is often being accused of the press has often been accused of leading to bias. Are there any good models for avoiding that bias? So first question again, a fairness doctrine. Second question, trust busting, and how can government funding be fair and not biased? So let me begin with Professor Carroll.
Thank you for those great questions. I think I'll take up the question about the fairness doctrine. And just say the fairness doctrine, it's interesting and people have been talking about it, I think, a lot recently for good reason, although the fairness doctrine is really the product of a different era. And I'm not sure how well it maps on to our current one. So if the idea is one of objectivity, and I'm going to call it old school objectivity, although maybe that's not fair, and giving us kind of both sides of an issue, like that's not really the kind of objectivity that we need right now in our news reporting, and not the kind of objectivity that journalists are talking about. Journalists are talking more about transparency, about being clear about where one is situated, in looking at the events around them, in thinking about justice and fairness and other contextuality and other elements of journalism. And I think journalism is doing this wholesale rethinking now about what that means. And I think it is a very, very good thing. And to the extent that doesn't nicely line up with this idea of a fairness doctrine, I'm not sure importing that context, even if it was super well-meaning, the ideas behind it were right then, we may need to let that evolve and think about what that means now and how that could be shaped through regulation.
Terrific. Nora Benavides, I'm going to come to you.
Sure. I think I'll sort of take the second one, if you will, around it's truth busting, trust busting.
Trust busting, yeah. So breaking up these big, large platforms, how would that affect these questions?
I would love to spend so much time on it. So that's part of why I took it, because I think it's, as an inflection point in the conversation, interesting to imagine what the breakup of monopolies would look like. Let's imagine 10 years from now. I guess I take a kind of like systemic view of the larger societal ills that we are facing. And I think that so much of the root problem here will persist despite breakups and sort of trying to undo the large monopolies at play. That being said, I actually think that it's worth discussing. And so some of our work at Penn has been sort of thinking about what do, from both the news and media perspective, as well as the platform perspective, what do the merger consolidation questions bring up, as well as then larger antitrust questions. And this is one where I would use Dr. Savage's sort of interdisciplinary framework here, that what's necessary to consider that if any solutions are plausible is how might we then develop the interdisciplinary set of players to think through what in practice that looks like. Because absent a kind of measured way of implementation, I worry that the ills will continue to pervade whatever platform structures we have. And at the end of the day, the work we do at Penn with people and with communities, it isn't about which platform they're on. It isn't about which news source. It's about the relationships and how they're trying to engage with other people. And so I guess there's sort of this like relational humanity element here. Maybe it's because my background is really as a civil rights lawyer, and I think about, how we are relating. And if we do not embed those questions in the kinds of regulatory solutions, we will not reach the root of the problem.
Let me turn to Devin.
I'm sorry, I think I'm not remembering
Sure.
the question.
Okay, yeah. So all the three questions, sorry. So the three questions, just to remind everyone, are government funding of the press, does that just create too much bias, or is there a good model for avoiding that that problem? Would trust busting, they're not really trusts, but would a kind of antitrust approach, meaning these companies are way too large, the platforms are way too large, and we break them up, and therefore, how does that impact or improve or not the problems of disinformation? And third, should we reinstate the fairness doctrine that the FCC used to use now a fairly long time ago, and is that possible to translate it all into social media? Those are all difficult questions that demand a lot more than the couple minutes we have. But if you'd like to entertain any of them.
Sure. So I'll take the first one, which I don't think my fellow panelists answered. So hopefully I'm adding something here. But on this question of whether the government should fund journalism, I think that it was sort of mentioned earlier, the importance of local media, the importance of local journalism, and in particular, independent media sources. We sort of talk about that actually in our paper, and the relationship between sort of consolidation and disinformation. There are a number of studies that sort of point to some of these effects around the world a couple of years actually before the United States started to experience the same thing. And I think those are important issues and important questions. I don't know that the government funding journalism is really exactly the answer, but I do think that more attention should be paid to preserving local media, to preserving independent players in journalism and supporting them. We sort of talk about the role that specifically minority-owned independent media outlets serve to defend communities against disinformation in the past when it came to voter suppressive efforts that were domestic voter suppression that was aimed towards communities to dispel rumors, to disseminate information. And now then the landscape is completely different, and there's a different relationship. There's a kind of relationship between those independent, formerly independent, owned media enterprises and social media companies with regard to how they disseminate information about to their audiences. And I think that's something that researchers should definitely examine. And I think that there's a lot of literature that sort of talks about these questions sort of in a broader way that goes back to propaganda from a much earlier period. And a lot of these questions have been considered in those contexts that I think are relevant for the types of issues that we're dealing with now in relation to disinformation online.
Terrific. And Professor Savage, this last question for you.
Yeah, so I think that some of the things that we really need are auditing tools around large technology companies and also auditing tools around governments. These auditing tools, I think, will be very helpful for understanding even how, on one hand, how are governments promoting political propaganda? How are they maybe manipulating and surveilling citizens? And I think that this will help the public have a better conversation around what is happening. These auditing tools, I think, will also be very helpful in terms of also understanding how large technology companies are using their algorithms to, again, also promote disinformation, promote certain political propaganda, and facilitate its dissemination. I think those auditing tools will be very helpful in terms of fighting disinformation and also having healthier conversations around who might be funding certain efforts.
Terrific. Thank you all so much. And Nora Benavides, I'm very happy to see the dog that is often wandering in the background. So
she's very passionate about disinformation, you know. If we were talking about local news, I think she wanders in at different times.
So Well, thank you all for this incredibly enlightening conversation. I know I've learned a tremendous amount from every one of you. So, and I know that you guys deserve hours and hours to answer to any of these questions. So I apologize for limiting your time. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.